Grandma and Grandpa's Garden, Class 6. It's getting to be about time to plant the summer garden. But before we do, let's check in on the spring garden and see how that's doing. So here is the spring garden, and it's doing okay. The Swiss chard here, you see a little baby Swiss chard, doing all right. Little spottiness here in the second round of Swiss chard. There's lettuce. The lettuce is doing fine. The spinach is probably the spottiest of all. You see there's a lot of gaps in there where we want spinach to be. But there are a few spinach plants. Here are our radishes. Radishes are doing fine, as are the onions. The onions we first planted are getting kind of thirsty. They're flopping over, but they're getting kind of old, and it's about time to eat them. And you can see off in the distance there, the more recently planted onions are doing fine. Looking at the peas, we've seen they've begun to recover from their encounter with the groundhog. Here is the one pea plant that did not get chomped on, and you can see that that's the one that's growing the tallest. It's already begun to grab a hold on this fence. Here the other smaller pea plants that got chomped on, but they're recovering, and so we should have some peas from this garden. Here are the potatoes. These, if you will remember, were the crop that we planted first, and they're doing pretty good. You remember we planted them in trenches. I've begun to cover over the trenches where the potatoes have grown. I left a little section here that's still a trench so that you can see what I mean. Here's the trench. Here's where the trench was, and we'll start filling this up as the potatoes start growing. And then the more they grow, the more we'll fill them up, and there'll be a mound around each potato plant, and more potatoes will grow in the ground in that mound. Now let's turn our attention to the summer garden. The first thing to plant in the summer garden are tomatoes. And you see I've already done that. You can look and see these black strips. 2 black strips. These black strips are gardening fabric, and we put those down for a number of reasons. They control weeds, but in our case, we're particularly interested in controlling disease, controlling a fungus. In each one of these, you'll see each one of these tomato plants is covered by a cage. Inside the cage, we have this smaller cage. That's to keep animals out. We don't want any animals chomping on our baby tomato plants. But around each one of those smaller cages is a big tall cage. And that is because tomato plants can grow quite a bit. There are 2 kinds of tomato plants. They're called determinate and indeterminate. What we have planted are indeterminate tomato plants. What that means is they never stop growing. They look kind of small now, but they will grow and grow and grow out the top, believe it or not, of this tomato cage. All of these tomato cages. In fact, we have extensions later on in the summer when some of these tomato plants grow really tall. We'll add to the top of these. The same is true with these cages. You notice these cages don't come up quite as high, but later on we'll add more of the cage and extend it up taller so that the tomato plants can grow as tall as they want. The next thing for us to plant will be sunflowers, and I've already prepared the string that will guide us to planting our sunflowers. Sunflowers are nice to feed birds in the wintertime, and they also look nice in the garden. I'm going to put a row of seeds right where the string is. So now I'm planting marigold seeds. The marigolds are flowers, can't eat them, but we're planting them right next to the tomatoes, because it turns out tomatoes really like marigolds. They like to have them nearby because they keep away some of the pests, some insects, and even some animals. So the seeds for marigolds are very light. They're kind of long and funny. So I'm planting them in this, under this string, covering them with just a little bit of soil. I just finished planting the marigolds under that string. Now we're going to do beans. We're going to put them under this string, and that's going to be right next to the peas. The next things to plant will be cucumber, pickles, winter squash, sometimes called butternut squash, and winter squash, sometimes called zucchini. Some people will plant these in rows like we've planted other vegetables, but we like to plant these particular vegetables in mounds, in little hills. Now you can't really see these hills very well, but I've already mounted up a few small hills, and in fact we have already planted some of these, some of the squash, and they're just beginning to come up. You can see here's a little baby squash. There's another little baby squash. In this next mound, the winter or butternut squash, you can see they're doing pretty well. And I'm going to plant these other hills that are right now empty except for some weeds that don't count. So in this hill, we'll be planting more zucchini. This hill, more butternut. And those other hills you probably can't see. There's one over there, there's one there. I'm going to be planting pickles and cucumbers. One of the chores that I'm doing while planting the summer garden is mulching. Mulching is when you take mulch, in this case we've got shredded leaves, and putting it underneath the plants around the soil. That discourages the weeds and holds in moisture. That is, when the rain comes down and soaks through, it won't evaporate so quickly. It won't go back up into the air. The mulch slows that process down. So I'm going to go through and through a number of parts of the garden here and add mulch to a number of the plants. So these are the final plants I've put in our summer planting. Here we see a full dill plant which we purchased, and then I've also sown some dill seeds underneath that string. I've also added here in the cages that protect them from animals, there's a pepper plant, another pepper plant, another, and then some basil. So that concludes the planting of our summer garden.